Before William Afton became one of gaming's most infamous villains, he was simply a man with a workshop, a business partner, and a gift for making machines feel alive. No one warned the public about him. No police file existed. No headline ever printed his name in connection to what he actually did. Not for years, not until players themselves, sitting alone in the dark, with nothing but a flashlight and a handful of cameras, started piecing together the truth he'd buried inside his own creations. This is a story about a man who built friendship into steel and fabric, who turned grief into machinery, and who very nearly got away with it completely. By the time you finish this, you'll understand exactly how a man like this could murder children inside a family restaurant and walk free for years, why his own body eventually became one of his prisons, and why decades later, fans are still finding new pieces of his story buried in code, in books, and in details so small that most players never notice them on a first playthrough. Some of what you're about to hear is settled, confirmed fact. Some of it is implication so strong the franchise itself treats it as truth. And some of it remains genuinely unresolved even now. We'll tell you exactly which is which as we go. Let's start at the very beginning, before any of it had a name. Afton's earliest history is one of the most deliberately obscured corners of this entire franchise. Unlike most horror icons, who get an origin scene, a moment audiences can point to and say, this is where it started. Afton doesn't get that. The games never show his childhood. There's no flashback to a difficult home life, no single traumatic event explaining why he became who he became. The novels touch on his early adulthood slightly more than the games do, but even there, the picture remains incomplete by design. What we do know, confirmed across both the books and supplementary game material, is that Afton showed an early fascination with engineering, animation, and the unsettling space where machinery starts to resemble something alive. This wasn't a hobby that emerged out of nowhere. It was the foundation of everything he would go on to build, and everything he would go on to destroy. It's worth pausing on this gap in his backstory, because it matters more than it might first seem. Horror stories usually want you to understand the monster, to trace a clean line from childhood, wound to adult violence. Afton denies audiences that comfort. He doesn't arrive with an excuse. He arrives already capable, already skilled, already drawn toward building things that blur the line between toy and something closer to a living creature. Whatever happened in his earliest years that pushed him in this direction, the franchise has chosen, consistently, not to tell us. Some fans read this as evidence that Afton was simply always this way, that his cruelty wasn't created by circumstance, but was present from the start, waiting for the right opportunity to express itself. Others argue that absence of information shouldn't be mistaken for absence of cause, and that we're simply missing chapters of his life story never got around to filling in. Both readings remain valid, because neither is contradicted by anything confirmed on screen or on the page. What is confirmed is the partnership that gave him his platform. At some point in young adulthood, William Afton meets a man named Henry Emily, and the two of them form what becomes one of the most consequential business relationships in gaming history, though neither of them could have possibly understood that at the time. Henry is, by almost every account given through the franchise's storytelling, the more grounded of the two, where Afton seems drawn to animatronics out of something closer to obsession, a fascination that borders on the unsettling even before any violence enters the picture. Henry's motivations read as warmer, more conventional. He wants to build something that brings joy to children. He wants his daughter to grow up surrounded by wonder. The novels in particular lean into this contrast, painting Henry as a man whose heart is genuinely in the right place, paired with a business partner whose heart, in retrospect, was never quite where anyone assumed it was. This partnership produces the earliest version of what will eventually become Fazbear Entertainment, though in these first years, it doesn't carry that name yet, and it isn't yet the sprawling, multi-location company most fans recognize from the games. It starts small. It starts personal. Afton and Henry worked together on early animatronic prototypes, refining the kind of robotics that will later populate every pizzeria, every horror attraction, and every haunted facility covered across this entire franchise. And crucially, this early period is also when both men's families become inseparably tied to the business itself. Henry has a daughter named Charlotte, called Charlie by everyone close to her. Afton has children of his own, including a daughter named Elizabeth and at least 2 sons, one of whom history will eventually remember simply as the Crying Child, since his actual given name was deliberately withheld from players for years and remains, even now, one of the franchise's smaller, lingering ambiguities depending on which piece of material you're drawing from. These children don't grow up at a distance from their father's work. They grow up inside it. The animatronic workshop isn't some sealed-off, dangerous space the kids are kept away from for safety. It's their playground. It's where they spend afternoons, surrounded by half-built mascot suits, exposed wiring, and prototype machines that haven't yet been refined into the cheerful, performance-ready characters that will later greet families at restaurant doors. This detail, that the very children who will later be wronged by this technology grow up trusting it completely, intimate with it, in a way that makes its eventual betrayal so much more devastating, isn't incidental to the story. It's the entire emotional architecture the franchise builds everything else on top of. The first physical location to emerge from this partnership is called Fredbear's Family Diner. If you're trying to understand William Afton's story, actually begins in a literal, physical sense, this is the place. It's smaller and more modest than the elaborate pizzerias that will come later, built around a single primary mascot. A golden-colored bear named Fredbear, accompanied by a yellow rabbit costume known as Spring Bonnie. These 2 suits deserve more attention than most casual newcomers give them, because understanding exactly what they are and exactly how they're built is essential to understanding nearly every major death across William Afton's entire timeline. Fredbear and Spring Bonnie aren't standard animatronics in the way later mascots like Freddy Fazbear or Bonnie the Rabbit will be. They're Springlock suits, a specific and deliberately dangerous category of technology that allows the costume to function in 2 completely different modes. In one mode, the suit operates as a fully autonomous animatronic, an endoskeleton wrapped in fabric and plastic, moving and performing on its own without anyone inside it. In the other mode, the entire endoskeleton can be compressed and folded inward, held in place by a series of springs and latches, creating enough internal space for an actual human being to climb inside and wear the suit like a costume, controlling its movements directly rather than relying on its built-in programming. This dual functionality sounds, on paper, like clever engineering. In practice, it's a catastrophe waiting to happen. The springs and latches holding the suit's compressed endoskeleton in place are never designed to safely accommodate a human body inside that space for extended periods. They're a mechanism built for brief, controlled use, not sustained wear, and the moment something goes wrong, the moment a latch fails or a spring releases unexpectedly, the suit's animatronic can snap back into its expanded, performance-ready shape with whoever's inside still occupying that space. The results, as we'll cover multiple times throughout this story, are catastrophic and frequently fatal. It's at Fredbear's Family Diner that the franchise's very first confirmed tragedy occurs, and it's worth being precise about something here. This death predates the more famous murders most casual fans associate with the original Five Nights at Freddy's game by a meaningful margin. The victim is Henry's daughter, Charlie. The details of exactly how she dies are conveyed primarily through the novel trilogy rather than the mainline games, told in a register that's softer and more fable-like than the blunt, mechanical horror of later entries, but the core fact underlying that softer presentation is brutal, unambiguous. Charlie dies on the property of Fredbear's Family Diner, and the person responsible for her death is William Afton. This isn't speculation pieced together from environmental clues or fan theory. It's confirmed, foundational canon, reinforced not just within the novels themselves, but through later crossover material that deliberately folds the novel's continuity into the same shared universe as the mainline games, closing what once been a more ambiguous gap between the two storytelling. tracks. Charlie's death is, chronologically, the first time William Afton kills a child. It happens before the murders at the original pizzeria. It happens before the bite that so many newer fans assume is the franchise's starting point. It is the true point of origin for everything that follows, the original sin this entire timeline is built on top of. What makes this death so quietly devastating, beyond the simple horror of a child's murder, is what it does to Henry. He doesn't learn the truth right away. For years, possibly for the bulk of his adult life, up to a certain pivotal moment we'll reach much later in this story, Henry believes his daughter's death was a tragic accident, a malfunction in the technology he himself helped design, rather than a deliberate act committed by his trusted business partner. This misunderstanding isn't a minor detail. It's the emotional driving Henry's entire arc across the rest of the franchise, including a final decision decades later that will close out William Afton's story permanently. That's a thread for much later. Right now, all that matters is this. Henry believed, for a very long time, that grief alone explained his daughter's death. He had no idea grief was simply the cover story for something far worse. William Afton's own children fare no better under his influence, though the timeline and exact mechanics of their tragedies unfold somewhat differently than Charlie's. His daughter, Elizabeth, during this same general period at the diner and in the surrounding years, develops a particular fascination with one of the workshop's prototype animatronics, a small, performance-oriented machine that will eventually evolve into something far more dangerous called Circus. Baby. Her story, chronologically, belongs to a slightly later point in the timeline than what we're covering right now, since her actual death occurs at a more advanced facility Afton's company builds afterward. But it's worth planting the seed of her fascination here, in these earliest years, because it establishes something crucial about the pattern forming around William Afton as a person. This isn't a man who loses control once, in a single isolated moment of weakness. This is a man surrounded, repeatedly, by warning signs connecting his creations to harm, who continues building dangerous machines anyway, seemingly unable or unwilling to stop. Afton's son, the boy fans have nicknamed the crying child due to his persistent on-screen sadness and the absence of any officially confirmed given name across most material, experiences the chapter of this story that most players actually witness directly, because his experience forms the entire narrative backbone of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. For years following that game's original release, players assumed they were watching real-time events. A frightened child barricaded inside his bedroom, fending off nightmare versions of animatronic characters night after night. The actual explanation, confirmed through later contextual reveals and item-based storytelling within the game itself, recontextualizes everything. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 isn't depicting literal events happening in real time at all. It's depicting the final, fading hallucinations of a dying child, lying in a hospital bed, his mind replaying trauma and fear as his body shuts down completely. The nightmare versions of Fredbear and his friends aren't monsters physically breaking into a house. They're a child's psyche processing the worst day of his life as death closes in. That worst day has become known throughout the fandom as the Bite of 83, even though the games themselves reference the specific date sparingly and somewhat inconsistently across different pieces of material. Here's what the timeline confirms happened. At Fredbear's family diner, the crying child becomes the target of persistent bullying, including from his own older brother, who fans have come to identify as Michael Afton, a character we'll spend considerable time with later in this story. During what should have been a celebratory occasion, a birthday party held at the diner, the older children force the younger boy toward the animatronic stage specifically, pushing him toward Fredbear as a cruel prank, banking on the era's widespread assumption that these spring-locked suits were perfectly safe for children to interact with directly. That assumption turns out to be catastrophically wrong. The Fredbear suit bites down on the child's head, an injury severe enough to require hospitalization, and based on everything Five Nights at Freddy's 4 depicts about his subsequent physical and psychological decline, it's heavily implied, though never stated with complete bluntness inside that specific game, that this injury is what ultimately leads to his death sometime later. This is the bite of 83, and distinguishing it clearly from a separate, less severe biting incident that occurs years afterward at a different location, an incident fans refer to as the bite of 87, remains one of the single most important pieces of groundwork any newcomer to this lore needs to establish. Confusing these two incidents, treating them as the same event or muddling their details together, is one of the most common mistakes people make when first encountering this story, and we'll address the second incident directly once we reach its proper place in the chronology. By the end of this earliest period, before a single location most casual fans actually recognize by name has even opened to the public, the human cost connected to William Afton has already become staggering. Charlie, Henry's daughter, is dead, killed directly by Afton's own hands. The crying child is dying, or already dead by the time the broader timeline catches up with him, the result of bullying compounded by a fundamentally unsafe piece of technology that Afton himself helped design and approve. And Afton's own daughter, Elizabeth, is already on a trajectory that will eventually end in her own death. Connected to a machine her father's company will go on to build. Two families, bound together by a shared business and what once seemed like a shared love, bringing machines to life, are already being quietly torn apart by the very thing that brought them together in the first place. And Henry, the man who still doesn't fully understand what his business partner has actually done, keeps building, keeps designing, keeps believing, apparently, that the next animatronic, the next location, the next innovation in this strange, intimate field of work might somehow turn out differently than everything that's come before it. It won't. What comes next is the event most casual fans actually associate with the name Five Nights at Freddy's when they hear it for the first time. The opening of the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and a disappearance of 5 additional children unresolved. Unjust deaths will go on to animate, quite literally, the entire remainder of this franchise's horror. But none of what happens next will land with anything close to its full weight unless you understand everything we've just covered. The animatronics at the center of this story were never simply monsters that appeared out of nowhere. They were built by a grieving father who didn't yet know the truth about his own daughter's death, and operated by a man who had already proven, more than once, exactly was capable of doing to children who trusted him completely. Let's go there now. Following the closure of Fredbear's family diner, a closure driven by the diner's declining reputation, and implicitly, the quiet trauma surrounding both Charlie's death and the crying child's injury, the partnership between William Afton and Henry Emily doesn't dissolve the way you might expect after this tragedy. Instead, it evolves into something larger, more ambitious, and, in retrospect, exponentially more dangerous. The diner concept is retired entirely, and in its place rises Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a new restaurant organized around an expanded mascot lineup that includes Freddy Fazbear himself, Bonnie the Rabbit, Chica the Chicken, and Foxy the Pirate Fox. This is the lineup most casual fans picture immediately when they hear this franchise's name. And this is the location where the series' most infamous, most foundational crime actually takes place. The year most commonly associated with this event, based on in-game material and minigame context, is 1985. During this period, a man wearing a security guard uniform, or in some interpretations simply an employee with after-hours access to the building, walks freely through Fazbear's Pizza, using a Freddy Fazbear suit as a lure to approach children individually, one at a time, exploiting the trust that mascot costume naturally inspires in young kids, who have no reason to suspect danger from a character designed specifically to seem friendly and safe. He kills 5 children across what the games imply is a relatively short span of time, hiding their bodies somewhere within the restaurant itself, and covering up their deaths so thoroughly and so effectively that the broader public never learns the full truth of what actually happened to them at least not a very long time. This man is William Afton. Fans and players have long referred to him during this specific period using the nickname Purple Guy, a name born entirely from his distinctive, pixelated color palette as he appears within the original game's hidden minigames, rather than from any in-universe designation. But there's no ambiguity about his identity once you connect the dots across the broader timeline. This is the same man from Fredbear's family diner. This is the same business partner Henry trusted implicitly. This is the same father whose own children had already suffered directly because of the animatronic technology he built and approved. The murders themselves are revealed to players gradually, almost incidentally, through a series of small, deliberately crude 8-bit minigames that appear between certain nights, contingent on the player surviving long enough to reach them. These minigames deserve more credit than casual observers sometimes give them, because they aren't simply flavor text or optional bonus content tucked away for completionists. They function as the actual narrative backbone of the entire original game, conveyed through a deliberately obscured, almost mythological storytelling register that forces players to actively piece together what happened rather than being told outright. This narrative choice mirrors, in a strange way, the in-universe mystery itself. Just as the families and investigators within this fictional world had to slowly uncover the truth behind these disappearances, players experiencing the game for the first time had to do the same, scrap of information by scrap of information, theory by theory, long before any of it was officially confirmed. Here's the detail that transforms this story from a tragic, grounded crime narrative into something supernatural, something that justifies the horror survival format the franchise becomes known for. The 5 murdered children don't simply disappear into the building's infrastructure and remain silent forever, the way a typical unsolved murder case might conclude in the real world. Their spirits don't move on to wherever spirits in this universe are supposed to go. Instead, something about this specific location, or perhaps something more directly tied to their physical proximity to them remains, allows their consciousness, their lingering presence, to possess the only things nearby capable of holding them, the animatronics themselves. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy become vessels, quite literally haunted machinery, for the murdered children's trapped souls. And these souls are anything but peaceful. They're angry, confused, and fixated on some warped, traumatized understanding of justice, even though their methods for pursuing that justice, as players quickly discover, are themselves twisted and dangerous in their own right. This single supernatural rule explains everything about how the original Five Nights at Freddy's actually plays. The animatronics roam the restaurant after dark and converge specifically on the security guard's office, not because of some generic malfunction or programming glitch, but because possessed children, drawn by some confused, traumatized instinct toward adult male figure present during the only hours they're capable of movement, are actively pursuing what they perceive, in some distorted sense, as the man responsible for their deaths. The player character, an ordinary person working a night shift purely for a paycheck, has unknowingly stepped directly into the aftermath of an unsolved mass murder, becoming the unwitting target of a haunting born from grief and unresolved violence that has nothing to do with him personally. There's a 6th animatronic connected to this period too, one that doesn't appear consistently across every night and seems to glitch and out of existence in a way the original game never fully explains within its own runtime. Golden Freddy. For years following the original release, this character represented one of the franchise's most actively debated mysteries, discussed and dissected across countless fan theories and forum threads. Later games and supplementary material eventually connect Golden Freddy directly back to the crying child, covered extensively in our previous section, suggesting that his spirit, too, ultimately ended up bound to this same supernatural governing these animatronics, despite belonging to a separate incident and a separate location entirely from the 5 children murdered specifically at this restaurant. We'll revisit and further clarify this connection once we reach the Ruin expansion much later in this story, since that release adds a name and considerably more context to exactly who Golden Freddy actually represents. Buried within these hidden minigames is a single phrase that has gone on to become one of the franchise's most quoted, most analyzed pieces of dialogue across its entire history. After completing a particular sequence of minigame objectives, a simple message appears on screen reading, "It's me." Fans have spent years debating exactly who is meant to be speaking this line, and what, precisely, it's meant to communicate, since the phrase appears in a context directly tied to the purple guy character's actions within that specific minigame sequence. While some ambiguity does remain around its full, precise implications, the dominant and most consistently supported interpretation across the broader fandom, reinforced by William Afton's confirmed identity as the perpetrator behind these murders, treats this moment as the closest the original game comes to a direct confession, a chilling, almost taunting acknowledgement delivered by the murderer himself, breaking through the game's otherwise distant, mythologized presentation of these events. The restaurant itself does not survive this. Word eventually spreads, whether through lingering rumors, unresolved missing persons reports, or according to some interpretations, an increasingly impossible to ignore smell of decay emanating from somewhere within the building's structure. The establishment is shut down, driven under by a combination of health and safety violations layered directly on top of the unresolved disappearances that the public, by this point, can no longer fully ignore. But closing the restaurant's doors does nothing to end the supernatural haunting now embedded within its animatronics. And it certainly does nothing to end William Afton's broader involvement with this technology and this company moving forward. One additional incident from this general era deserves direct attention here, specifically because it's so frequently confused with the Bite of 83 covered in our previous section, and properly untangling is essential for navigating this timeline without getting lost. At some point during this same broad period, a separate biting incident occurs, this time involving a restaurant employee named Fritz Smith, and one of the venue's animatronics, widely believed by the fandom, based on contextual and environmental evidence, to be Foxy specifically. This event has become known throughout the community as the Bite of 87. Unlike the original Bite, this incident doesn't carry anywhere near the same emotional or familial weight in terms of direct tragedy to the Afton or Emily families, but it's referenced clearly enough across supplementary material and in-game Easter eggs that it warrants recognition as its own, distinct, separate event occurring years after the original incident and at a meaningfully different stage of this overall chronology. If you walk away from this section remembering only one organizational detail, make it this. These are two separate bites, separated by years, involving different animatronics, different victims, and very different consequences for the broader story. By the conclusion of this period, the portrait of William Afton as a character has fully crystallized into something undeniable. This isn't a man who experienced a single moment of weakness or lost control, just once under extraordinary circumstances. This is a man now responsible for at least 6 confirmed child deaths, counting Charlie, the crying child, and the 5 victims murdered specifically at the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and he has accomplished all of this while continuing to operate freely within the very same company, working alongside a business partner who still, even now, doesn't fully grasp the true extent of what his closest collaborator is actually capable of. The animatronics that once represented nothing more complicated than childhood joy and family entertainment become something else entirely. Literal containers for grief, rage, and unresolved injustice, animated nightly by the very souls Afton personally extinguished. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closes its doors for good, but William Afton himself is nowhere close to finished. His company continues pushing forward, expanding into new technology, new locations, and increasingly ambitious ventures, and somewhere within that ongoing expansion, his own daughter Elizabeth is about to become his next victim, inside a facility specifically built around the exact category of animatronic she has always loved most. Before we follow that thread forward, though, there's a second restaurant worth addressing directly, one that complicates the chronology in ways that genuinely confuse fans for years before official clarification eventually settled the matter. This second location is the restaurant most newcomers assume comes after the original murders we just covered, but the actual chronological relationship considerably more tangled than its release order as a sequel might suggest. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 introduces an entirely new building, brighter and more technologically modern than the original location, populated by an updated lineup of animatronics, including Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, Toy Chica, a perpetually damaged-looking fox character named Mangle, and a small, balloon-carrying character, Balloon Boy. For years, the assumption among fans was straightforward. This location must come after the original restaurant, since it's numbered as a sequel and clearly represents updated, more advanced technology. The actual confirmed chronology complicates that assumption considerably. This restaurant, despite its sequel numbering in terms of release order, takes place chronologically before the murders covered in our previous section, before the original Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy ever became possessed by the five children's spirits. The voice players hear across this game's nightly phone messages belongs to a character fans have nicknamed Phone Guy, and he isn't merely an exposition device here. He's a genuine employee working at this specific location, and his fate becomes one of the more quietly devastating confirmed details connected to this particular chapter of Afton's ongoing pattern of violence. Partway through the game, his recorded messages cut off abruptly, mid-sentence, strongly implying something violent has happened to him during an overnight shift. Later supplementary material confirms exactly what that implication suggests. Phone Guy doesn't simply quit his position or get reassigned elsewhere within the company. He's murdered, his body subsequently stuffed inside one of the facility's spare animatronic suits, a detail that becomes especially grim once you understand who, specifically, is responsible. That responsibility traces directly back to the same man at the center of this entire story. William Afton, still operating actively within his own company throughout this period, is confirmed as the perpetrator behind this particular murder, continuing an established pattern that, by this stage in the timeline, should genuinely surprise no one paying close attention. Phone Guy isn't the only victim connected to this specific location either. This game's own hidden minigames, structured in a manner deliberately similar to the original title's storytelling approach, reveal that Afton lures and murders several additional children at this location as well, employing the exact same successful method he's relied on previously, using a trusted, friendly mascot suit as bait to gain a vulnerable child's trust before striking. This particular chapter also complicates the franchise's own mascot mythology in a fascinating and disturbing way. The newer, more colorful toy animatronics populating this location are equipped with built-in facial recognition software, installed, somewhat ironically, specifically as a safety measure intended to help these machines reliably distinguish children from adults and avoid accidentally causing harm during normal operating hours. The unintended, horrifying side effect of this safety feature is that these same animatronics begin exhibiting clear hostility toward adult men specifically during nighttime hours, a behavioral shift that becomes deeply, uncomfortably convenient once you realize that children's spirits, murdered at this very location, are very plausibly the ones now actively influencing the toy animatronics' aggressive behavior once darkness falls. After the murders connected to this second location are eventually discovered, or at minimum suspected strongly enough by management or authorities to force a shutdown, the older, more worn original-style Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy models, the same animatronics already possessed from the murders covered in our previous section, are brought out of storage and temporarily reintroduced into this same facility, operating directly alongside the newer toy models during the exact same period covered throughout this particular game. This detail directly explains one of the more genuinely confusing structural elements newcomers frequently struggle with. Why Five Nights at Freddy's 2 prominently features both older, withered animatronic designs and newer toy models simultaneously, despite this entire location apparently taking place chronologically before the original pizzeria's own murders have fully concluded, according to some interpretations of the timeline. The explanation is that these withered models represent leftover technology recycled from the diner era and from early prototype connected to Fredbear's pizza. Reused here before that original location. The one most casual fans immediately picture when they hear this franchise's name is even fully established and operating as its own independent, standalone restaurant. It's worth being completely direct about something here, since this represents one of the more genuinely tangled aspects of officially confirmed canon across this franchise's history. The exact chronological relationship connecting this second pizzeria to the original murders we covered previously has shifted somewhat across different official statements released over the years, and fan consensus regarding the precise overlapping order of certain specific details isn't entirely unanimous even today. What does remain solid and consistently confirmed across every version of this explanation is the core sequence of events itself. Phone Guy's murder, the deaths of several additional children connected directly to William Afton, the facial recognition malfunction enabling possessed animatronics to target adults, and the eventual closure of this location, all of which meaningfully deepen Afton's confirmed body count and further cement his established pattern of behavior before his temporary, near-fatal defeat in the chapter we're about to cover next. By the conclusion of this period, Afton has once again successfully evaded any meaningful consequence for murder, this time claiming an adult employee's life in addition to several more children. The company, originally founded on a friendship between two passionate engineers, now carries the weight of two separate locations tainted by mass death, and the original animatronics, worn down and recycled into renewed use, carry their possessed occupants directly into this second restaurant's final, chaotic, ultimately doomed nights of operation. It's during this same general window of time, with the possessed spirits trapped within these animatronics now fully, painfully aware of exactly who bears responsibility for everything that's happened to them, that they finally receive the opportunity to act on years of accumulated rage, unresolved grief. They corner Afton. And as we're about to cover in considerable detail, that confrontation sends him fleeing directly into the one place he mistakenly believes might offer him protection. An old, spring-locked spring bonnie suit, the very same model of dangerous technology that started this entire chain of tragedy back at Fredbear's family diner. Setting into motion the mechanical betrayal, very nearly ends William Afton's story for good, decades before its actual conclusion. Somewhere beneath the surface, far removed from any public-facing storefront or family-friendly signage, William Afton's company instructs something it never publicly advertises or acknowledges. No billboard along a highway, no flyers handed out for birthday parties, no smiling mascot character greeting families at an entrance door. This particular facility exists for one purpose alone: research, testing, and the manufacturing of an entirely new generation of animatronic technology, more advanced and significantly more experimental than anything the public has previously encountered through Afton's various restaurant ventures. And it's within this sealed-off, underground complex that the story of Michael Afton, William's surviving son, truly begins to take meaningful shape within this overall narrative. By this particular point in the timeline, Michael has spent years living beneath the crushing weight of his family's ongoing collapse. His younger brother died following the consequences of the bite of 83, an incident Michael himself bears some direct responsibility for setting in motion through his own participation in childhood bullying. His younger sister Elizabeth died inside technology built directly by this very company, consumed by a machine called Circus Baby, that was originally designed and marketed as a source of joy and entertainment. His father vanished almost entirely from public life, and the persistent rumors swirling around him, murder, mysterious disappearances, a man frequently described wearing a distinctive purple shirt, never fully faded away despite the passage of considerable time. Michael grew up directly within the wreckage of all of this accumulated tragedy, and at some specific point, he reaches a decision. He's finished simply waiting passively for answers that clearly aren't going to arrive on their own. He goes looking for his father directly, by whatever means necessary. This decision is where Five Nights at Freddy's sister location formally begins, although the game itself never explicitly states Michael's identity outright at any point during its runtime. It refers to its protagonist simply as the technician, a newly hired night shift employee taking a position at a remote, isolated facility known as Fazbear Entertainment and Rental. Players spent considerable time following this game's original release debating exactly who this largely silent protagonist actually represented, and later supplementary material, including direct statements made outside the boundaries of the games themselves, eventually confirms what many observant fans had already suspected. This is Michael Afton deliberately using this job opportunity as cover while he digs into what actually happened to his sister, and by logical extension, attempts to locate his missing, presumed dangerous father. The facility itself operates in a manner that feels almost like an unsettling fusion between a theme park attraction and a corporate research laboratory. Each night, the technician is guided through different sections of this sprawling underground complex by an artificial intelligence voice, ostensibly performing what are described as routine, fairly mundane maintenance tasks. But almost immediately upon starting his first shift, something feels deeply wrong about the entire situation. The animatronics populating this facility, marketed under the branding of the Funtime line, are considerably more advanced and significantly more unsettling than anything previously seen across the earlier pizzeria locations covered in our previous sections. There's Funtime Freddy, accompanied by a small, puppet-like companion character called Bon Bon. There's Funtime Foxy, later confirmed through supplementary material to actually be the same animatronic previously known as Mangle from the second pizzeria, repurposed and reintroduced specifically for use within this new facility. And presiding over the entirety of this complex is the singular piece of technology this entire location was specifically built around: Circus Baby herself. This is the very same baby introduced earlier in our discussion of Elizabeth Afton's death, except here, fully active, even an actual voice for the first time across the franchise's history. Baby reveals herself to be considerably more calculating and self-aware than anything the technician, or the player controlling him, could have reasonably anticipated walking in. She speaks directly to the player throughout each night's shift, offering guidance, issuing warnings, and providing information that frequently contradicts whatever the facility's primary controlling system, a separate artificial intelligence presence overseeing the broader complex, happens to be telling him simultaneously. It becomes increasingly clear, the deeper into the facility the technician travels, that something is actively manipulating events from behind the scenes, deliberately orchestrating circumstances specifically designed to trap him rather than simply employ him for routine maintenance work as initially advertised. The further Michael ventures into this facility, the clearer and more disturbing the overall picture becomes. Baby isn't simply malfunctioning in some unpredictable accidental sense. She's actively executing a carefully considered plan. Her ultimate goal, pieced together gradually through the game's unfolding events, and later explicitly confirmed through supplementary lore material, involves using a specific mechanism built directly into the facility, chillingly referred to in universe as the scooper, to physically scoop out a human body, creating a vessel that her own consciousness, along with the combined consciousness of the facility's other Funtime animatronics, can subsequently use to escape this underground complex entirely and exist freely within the outside world for the first time. The technician becomes the specific target of this carefully laid plan. Toward the conclusion of the game, following a fire that breaks out within the facility's primary auditorium space, the various Funtime animatronics, having shed their external outer shells entirely, combine their individual endoskeletons together into a single, grotesque amalgamation composed of Tangled wires, salvaged mechanical parts, and synthetic skin material pulled directly from the facility's various animatronic mascots. This combined entity becomes known throughout the fandom as Ennard, and Ennard's overarching plan turns out be exactly what Baby intended from the very beginning of this entire sequence of events. Using Michael's own body as an effective disguise, Ennard climbs directly inside him, piloting his physical form like a puppet, fully intending to wear his body out of the facility entirely and into the wider world beyond its sealed walls. For a meaningful period of time following this event, Michael technically survives, though not as himself in any psychologically or physically meaningful sense. He becomes essentially a host, his own body controlled entirely from within by the combined collective will of Ennard, the very same entity formed directly from his sister's repurposed animatronic remains alongside the facility's other funtime machines. Eventually, N makes the decision to abandon this particular body once it begins visibly decaying from the inside, having already successfully served its primary purpose, physically transporting them out of the underground facility and into the broader world. What remains of Michael afterward, alive in a strictly biological sense but profoundly, permanently changed by everything he's just endured, becomes a quietly devastating narrative thread that the franchise deliberately picks back up again considerably later, once he eventually resurfaces under a new identity, driven by one singular, focused purpose: tracking down his father once for all, this time armed with hard-won lessons learned from having personally witnessed, in the most visceral way imaginable, exactly how far these animatronics, and the people responsible for building them, were genuinely willing to go. It's worth pausing here to fully recognize what this particular chapter actually represents within the broader structure of this overall timeline. Sister Location isn't merely another haunted location added arbitrarily to an already growing list of dangerous facilities. It's the specific chapter where the Afton family's intensely private tragedy and the franchise's broader public horror finally merge together completely and irreversibly. Elizabeth's death, covered extensively in our earlier discussion, wasn't simply an isolated incident confined neatly to a home environment or limited to a single malfunctioning toy. It directly served as the origin point for an entire underground operation that her own father personally built and oversaw, an operation her own brother would later walk directly into, entirely unaware that he was unknowingly stepping straight into machinery constructed, quite literally, from the wreckage of his own sister's death. There's also a quieter, more genuinely unsettling implication buried within this particular chapter that becomes increasingly important as this story continues to unfold. William Afton himself remains conspicuously, almost suspiciously absent throughout the entirety of Sister Location's events. He never directly appears on screen. He never speaks. His physical presence within the facility during these specific events is never explicitly confirmed one way or another. Yet his influence, his decisions, and his fingerprints are unmistakably present across every single piece of technology involved in this entire sequence. He personally approved these designs. He built and authorized the systems that made manipulation on the scale demonstrates even possible in the first place. Whether or not he was physically present underground during these particular nights becomes almost beside the point. His decisions, his consistent negligence, and his well-established pattern of building increasingly dangerous machines despite repeated, escalating tragedy are unambiguously the reason was ever possible in the first place. By the conclusion of this particular chapter, Michael Afton has lost his own body entirely to the very technology his family's company directly created. His sister's trapped consciousness has played a direct, active role in causing that loss, an entirely new combined entity, born from years of Afton robotics unchecked, increasingly reckless ambition, now exists somewhere out in the wider world, no longer confined to a single underground facility the way it once was. Meanwhile, the original site of the very first confirmed murders, the burned-out, abandoned remains of the original Fredbear's pizza, hasn't remained quiet either during this same general period. Word has gradually gotten out, in the peculiar way these things eventually do, that the old, abandoned building is supposedly haunted by something genuinely sinister. And somewhere, quietly, a new business venture is beginning to form around that persistent rumor, one that will eventually drag William Afton's abandoned, spring-locked body directly back out into the light, setting the stage for the next major chapter of this ongoing, escalating story. To properly understand what happens during this next phase, you need to rewind the timeline slightly, back to a moment that technically occurs years before the events of Sister Location, even though its eventual consequences ripple forward directly into everything we just finished covering. While Michael was being slowly consumed by Ennard far beneath the surface, the man directly responsible for initiating this entire chain of escalating tragedy was facing a reckoning entirely of his own, one that had been quietly building since the very first confirmed murders at the original Fazbear's Pizza all those years earlier. Following that restaurant's eventual closure, its animatronics, Freddy, Bonnie, Foxy sat largened within the sealed, decaying building. But they were never forgotten by the 5 children whose spirits remained permanently trapped inside them. Possessed by murdered souls who never received anything resembling justice for what happened to them, these particular animatronics retained a single, intensely fixated purpose, the exact same underlying instinct that drove them to relentlessly corner the security guard during the original game's nightly shifts earlier. They wanted the specific man responsible for their deaths. They wanted William Afton himself. At some point following the restaurant's official closure, Afton makes the decision to return to this original location. Exactly why he chooses to go back is left somewhat genuinely open to interpretation across different pieces of material, though the most consistent and widely accepted explanation throughout the franchise's broader storytelling is unsettlingly straightforward. He returns specifically to destroy whatever lingering evidence still exists connecting him to his crimes, particularly the suits and animatronics that contain whatever spiritual or supernatural proof, in whatever metaphysical sense applies within this particular universe's internal logic of his actions still remains. He isn't anticipating any kind of confrontation upon his return. He's expecting to find nothing more than an empty, long-abandoned building. He's catastrophically wrong about this assumption. The 5 possessed animatronics finally presented with the exact opportunity they've been patiently waiting for since the moment of their own deaths. Successfully corner Afton somewhere within the building's interior. In a sudden moment of genuine desperation, searching frantically for anywhere to hide, or any conceivable way to protect himself from what's rapidly closing in around him, he makes the fateful decision to climb directly inside one of the old, spring-locked suits, over from his very first business venture alongside Henry, the same golden rabbit suit known as Spring Bonnie, the exact same model of suit, alongside Fredbear himself, that started this entire dating timeline all those years earlier back at the original diner. This single decision represents the precise moment where the franchise's most disturbing recurring mechanical detail, carefully established all the way back in our earliest discussion of springlock technology, finally and devastatingly pays off within the broader narrative. Spring-locked suits, as previously established, are fundamentally unsafe for sustained human use under any circumstances. They're constructed with an animatronic endoskeleton folded compactly inside a series of springs and latches specifically designed suit's external shape. And those particulars were never engineered to safely accommodate the awing weight or movement of an actual living human body operating from within that confined space for any extended period of time. Afton climbs inside Spring Bonnie, genuinely believing it will offer him meaningful protection, shielding him effectively from the possessed animatronics, rapidly closing in around his position. And for a brief moment, this strategy actually appears to work as intended. The possessed children, whatever specific instinct or compulsion drives their relentless pursuit, apparently cannot bring themselves to directly attack him while he remains hidden within the exact same category of suit, so directly connected to their own deaths, or perhaps they simply, temporarily, lose track of his exact location, effectively hidden as he is within familiar, previously trusted machinery. But the suit itself ultimately becomes the actual trap. As Afton remains hidden inside it for an extended period, the internal springs and locking mechanisms holding the entire costume together gradually begin to fail under the unanticipated strain. The locks release unexpectedly. The animatronic frame contained within the suit violently collapses inward, and Afton's body becomes brutally crushed and impaled by the very same springs and mechanical components that were supposedly meant to be actively protecting him throughout this entire ordeal. It's a brutal, almost poetically cruel death in its underlying symbolism, the exact same mechanical flaw that once bit a child back at the original diners earlier, now closing in directly on the man ultimately responsible for that incident, and everything that subsequently followed from it across this entire timeline. Crucially, though, this moment doesn't actually represent the end of William Afton's story. And this particular detail is genuinely one of the most important pieces of information for properly understanding everything that follows afterward across the remainder of this timeline. He doesn't die outright from these injuries. Later games and considerable supplementary material make abundantly clear that Afton somehow survives this catastrophic injury in some severely diminished, barely alive state, his physical body now permanently fused with the suit's collapsed wreckage, kept alive considerably longer than should reasonably be physically possible under any normal circumstances. Whether this unusual, prolonged survival results purely from his own sheer force of will, some lingering supernatural effect already established as actively present within these animatronics throughout this timeline, or is simply ambiguous body horror that the franchise has deliberately chosen never to fully explain in concrete terms, remains one of this timeline's openly acknowledged gray areas, even among dedicated fans. What is definitively confirmed is that his body remains exactly where it falls, trapped indefinitely inside the ruined Spring Bonnie suit, abandoned within the original restaurant's now permanently sealed walls. The restaurant itself, already shut down following the original confirmed murders, closes permanently after this particular incident. There's no indication anywhere in available material that anyone involved even realizes what actually happened inside the building. No public knowledge whatsoever that the man responsible for the original disappearances ultimately met his own gruesome end within the very same building where he originally committed crimes. The location simply goes completely quiet, sealed away from public access entirely, left to gradually decay alongside everything else still contained inside it, including Afton's barely functioning, still fused permanently within the suit's collapsed frame. This extended silence doesn't persist indefinitely, however, and understanding exactly how it eventually ends is essential, because it directly shapes where this overall story travels next. Years later, the old building's established reputation as the site of numerous unsolved disappearances doesn't simply fade away alongside its official closure. If anything, the passage of considerable time gradually transforms the location into something closer to genuine local legend. Exactly the kind of abandoned building widely rumored to be haunted that eventually attracts precisely the kind of attention that leads someone, somewhere, to seriously consider turning this accumulated tragedy into a legitimate business opportunity. A horror attraction specifically designed to capitalize directly on the building's genuinely grim history, built around one particularly fateful decision made by its new owners. Interpreting can still be physically salvaged from the original structure directly into the new attractions, overall design, and presentation. That singular decision is precisely what eventually pulls Afton's ruined body, still technically alive within the wreckage of the Spring Bonnie suit after everything we've just covered, back out into the world once again. The suit, and the barely surviving consciousness still trapped somehow within it, becomes the unwitting centerpiece of an entirely new horror experience built directly on top of the accumulated trauma surrounding the original murders. Fans have given this particular version of the character a name that has permanently stuck within the franchise's broader lexicon ever since: Springtrap. It's worth noting this isn't an official designation Afton himself ever actually uses, but it perfectly captures exactly what he's become by this point in the story. A man permanently caught, quite literally spring-trapped within the direct consequences of his own accumulated crimes, kept alive by mechanisms he personally once approved and helped design, brought back out into the light by people who have absolutely no idea what they're actually putting on public display within their new attraction. By the conclusion of this particular chapter, the man directly responsible for nearly every single death covered throughout this story so far, Charlie, the crying child, Elizabeth, and the 5 children murdered at the original pizzeria, is no longer simply a fugitive quietly hiding from consequences he's successfully evaded for years. He's become something considerably closer to an actual ghost trapped within a broken machine, barely alive in any conventional sense, sealed away within an abandoned building that the wider world has gradually started mythologizing without any real understanding of the genuine truth buried directly inside. That truth is about to be uncovered once again, this time by an entirely new set of people who have absolutely no understanding of what they're actually walking into. This concludes the first major movement of William Afton's complete story, but his journey is nowhere close to finished. Ahead lies Fazbear's fright, the fire that nearly ends everything, a son's calculated trap built specifically to lure his own father back into the light, and Henry Emily's final, devastating reckoning with the partner he once trusted completely. Beyond that waits an entirely new era of horror. A corrupted digital remnant calling itself Glitchtrap, a masked figure named Vanny, a sprawling pizzaplex built to bury history forever, and the reconstituted nightmare known as Burntrap. The deepest mysteries, the ones fans are still actively debating today, are still ahead of us. By this point in the timeline, the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has been closed for years, its windows boarded, its name reduced to little more than a rumor passed quietly by people who don't fully understand what actually happened inside its walls. But rumors of this particular kind rarely stayed forever, especially not within a culture that has always had a strange, persistent fascination with horror and true crime. Eventually, someone makes the decision that the building's genuinely grim reputation might actually be worth converting into a legitimate business venture. That business becomes known as Fazbear's Fright, the horror attraction, a haunted house-style experience specifically constructed to capitalize directly on the legend surrounding the original location's unresolved disappearances. The owners behind this particular venture have no direct connection to Henry Emily or to whatever remains of the original Fazbear Entertainment leadership structure by this point. They're outside investors looking to profit from an urban legend, and in their pursuit of genuine authenticity for paying customers, they make a decision that ultimately proves catastrophic. They salvage actual physical remains from the old, condemned building to use as authentic props and set pieces throughout their new attraction. Among the wreckage pulled from that sealed-off location is a suit nobody involved fully understands the history of: a damaged, severely decayed golden rabbit costume found crumpled in on itself, looking considerably less like a recognizable mascot and considerably more like something that has been through genuinely unspeakable trauma. They have absolutely no idea this is Spring Bonnie. They have no idea whatsoever that a man remains, somehow, barely alive inside it. To them, it's simply an unusually well-preserved, appropriately disturbing piece of set dressing, exactly the kind of effectively creepy centerpiece a horror attraction would actively want for its main display. This is precisely how William Afton, broken and permanently fused inside his ruined suit since the events covered in our previous discussion, ends up back within a building spotlight, surrounded once again by paying customers walking through a maze specifically designed to frighten them. Intentionally, the dramatic irony embedded in this situation is genuinely difficult to overstate. People are paying money specifically to be frightened by a prop that is, in complete secrecy, the actual unresolved horror, the very legend they've paid admission to experience firsthand. Players take on the role of a night security guard working at this new attraction, a position that exists largely because the location, despite being a recently constructed horror experience rather than an aging building, keeps experiencing unexplained technical problems and equipment malfunctions during overnight hours. It doesn't take particularly long for the guard, and by extension the player controlling him, to realize these supposed malfunctions aren't malfunctions at all in any conventional sense. The suit recovered from the old building has begun moving entirely on its own after dark, and both fans and the game itself eventually confirm exactly what's happening here. Afton, despite the sheer severity of his accumulated injuries, retains enough residual animation and conscious awareness within the wreckage to move the attraction during nighttime hours, now operating under the name the fandom has permanently attached to, going forward, Springtrap. But Springtrap isn't the only lingering presence actively haunting this particular building, and this is where the chapter's genuine emotional weight really comes into sharp focus. The same 5 children whose spirits originally possessed the original Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy animatronics, the very same souls who chased Afton directly into the Spring Bonnie suit in the first place, remain present here too, existing in some lingering, considerably weakened form now, connected directly to the building itself rather than to any functioning animatronic body the way they previously were. Throughout the various nights spent at Fazbear's Fright, the guard begins experiencing strange visual and audio hallucinations, fragmented images of old animatronics, static-filled visual distortions, and garbled, distorted audio messages, all of it strongly suggesting these trapped spirits remain genuinely nearby, still consciously aware, and still entirely fixated on the man hiding somewhere within the golden suit these same halls each night. The attraction itself eventually catches fire, and this particular detail matters considerably more than it might initially seem on the surface. Some interpretations directly connect this blaze to Springtrap's increasingly erratic, increasingly dangerous activity throughout the various overnight shifts, while other interpretations leave the exact underlying cause deliberately ambiguous, refusing to commit to a single definitive explanation. What remains clearly confirmed regardless of interpretation is the actual outcome itself. The building burns completely, destroying Fazbear's Fright entirely and crucially, providing the 5 trapped children's spirits with one final, definitive opportunity to directly confront the man who originally killed them, decades removed from their own deaths and years removed from his. This is precisely where the franchise introduces one of genuinely important storytelling mechanics, something that subsequently becomes a recurring structural element across later games as well. Scattered throughout the various nights spent at Fazbear's Fright, players can locate and complete a specific series of hidden minigames, directed directly particular children and specific objects tied meaningfully to their individual deaths. Successfully completing these minigames in their proper, intended sequence triggers what fans have come to call the game's true ending, a quiet, almost genuinely peaceful sequence depicting the 5 children's spirits finally achieving some meaningful form of closure, their previously unfinished business resolved sufficiently to allow them to move on entirely from the physical world they've remained trapped within for so long. This particular development matters enormously for properly understanding where this overall timeline travels from this point forward. After years spent trapped, angry, and fixated entirely on revenge against the man who murdered them, a pattern thoroughly displayed across every prior game covered throughout this story so far, the original 5 victims finally receive something genuinely resembling rest. It represents one of the only moments across this entire franchise's otherwise bleak history where a fundamental wrong gets meaningfully, even if incompletely, righted. The children obviously don't get their actual lives back. Nothing within this story ever pretends that's genuinely possible. But they do get to finally stop being trapped, stop being repeatedly weaponized inside various animatronic shells, and finally, genuinely leave this world behind. Afton himself does not share in this particular resolution. Whatever actually happens to him during the fire that ultimately destroys Fazbear's fright, the games deliberately leave unclear in the immediate moment, refusing to definitively confirm whether he dies here outright, manages to escape somehow, or survives in some further diminished physical state. What does remain clear, based on everything that follows immediately afterward across this timeline, is that this moment doesn't represent the last time his name, or his ruined physical body, resurfaces within this ongoing story. The suit itself may burn completely. The building may collapse entirely around it. But the man trapped inside, and the company built directly on top of his accumulated crimes, isn't genuinely finished yet. Not by a considerable margin. Henry Emily, watching all of this unfold from whatever distance he's deliberately maintained over the intervening years, is paying considerably closer attention than anyone around him likely realizes. He understands, by this particular point in the story, exactly what his former business partner has actually done, not merely to the 5 children murdered at the original restaurant, to his own family as well, including the daughter Henry lost at the very beginning of this entire story. The fire at Fazbear's Fright doesn't end Henry's ongoing involvement in any of this unfolding situation. If anything, it actively sharpens his resolve toward a final confrontation he's been quietly, methodically working toward for years now, one specifically designed not merely to stop Afton, but to ensure with absolute certainty that nothing remotely like this can ever happen again to anyone else. That confrontation is coming. And when it finally arrives, it won't be an accident, a malfunction, or simply a profitable rumor turned into a business venture that happened to go catastrophically wrong. It will be entirely deliberate, and it will be permanently final. Everything across this entire timeline has been quietly building toward one specific night, one particular location, and one decisive choice made by a man who has considerable years quietly absorbing every single tragedy his former partner directly caused. This represents the chapter where William Afton's original story and the founding generation of this franchise's particular brand of horror finally reaches its conclusion, though not necessarily in the manner most newcomers might initially expect going in. After Enard abandoned Michael Afton's body once it began visibly decaying from the inside, Michael doesn't simply vanish entirely from this ongoing story. He survives, visibly disfigured and profoundly changed by his experience, and he spends the considerable time afterward driven by a single, focused purpose: locating his father once and for all and definitively ending this entire situation permanently. Using an inheritance left behind through Fazbear Entertainment's increasingly collapsed business holdings, Michael makes the decision to open an entirely new pizzeria, ostensibly a straightforward restaurant venture on paper, but in actual reality, a deliberately constructed trap. He understands, based on everything he's personally witnessed, that his father has an established pattern returning to wherever these animatronics eventually end up. He's specifically counting on that exact pattern repeating itself once again. The new restaurant gradually accumulates various salvaged animatronics pulled from across the franchise's entire ruined history, scrap parts and broken machines purchased at considerably reduced prices, specifically because nobody else wants anything whatsoever connected to Fazbear Entertainment's increasingly tainted public reputation anymore. Among the wreckage gathered together within this new building are Scrap Baby, representing what remains of Circus Baby, Bide, extension, Elizabeth's trapped spirit, Molten Freddy, a tangled mass directly connected back Enard's earlier breakdown and dissolution, and Lefty, an unassuming, relatively plain-looking animatronic that ultimately turns out to be by far the most important machine within the entire building. Players take on the role of this new restaurant's night employee, again directly named on screen at any point, but later confirmed through supplementary material to be Michael Afton himself, working specifically within the very location he personally built to deliberately draw his father out of, hiding once and for all. Across the various nights covered throughout this game, communication will arrive from a mysterious, unidentified source, eventually revealed to be Henry Emily himself, guiding the player through increasingly strange, increasingly specific instructions, building methodically towards something considerably larger than a typical, mundane work shift. On the game's final night, William Afton, drawn back exactly as Michael had carefully anticipated, appears once again, somehow alive in some form despite everything that previously happened to him at Fazbear's Fright. What follows represents one of the more genuinely grotesque, body horror-heavy sequences across this entire franchise's history. Using a mechanism left over from the building's various salvaged equipment, functioning similarly in concept to the scooper previously seen in sister location, Afton's physical remains are mechanically processed once again, an act that produces Springtrap, yet another diminished, actively decaying, physical form of the same man who has, by this point in the story, somehow survived multiple supposed deaths across this entire extended timeline. But this time, something is genuinely different, and it's the specific detail that finally brings this entire saga full circle, in a deeply satisfying narrative sense. Lefty, the unassuming animatronic gathered among the restaurant's various salvaged parts, isn't simply spare equipment waiting to be repurposed. Henry Emily, the man who has spent the considerable majority of his adult life mourning a daughter he didn't fully understand about until far too late, has been quietly planning this exact moment for years now. Inside Lefty resides the spirit of Henry's own daughter, the very first child killed all the way back at the beginning of this entire story, brought back into active participation specifically for this final, climactic confrontation. Henry reveals himself directly to both the player and to Afton during this closing sequence. He's not genuinely interested in escape, in revenge pursued through further violence, or in any additional ongoing confrontation. He's interested specifically ending this entire destructive cycle permanently. He locks the building down completely, trapping everyone inside simultaneously, including all the possessed and partially possessed animatronics still carrying the lingering remnants of murdered children across this entire story, and deliberately sets the entire restaurant ablaze, with himself, Afton, and the various trapped spirits all remaining inside together. This represents Henry's final, defining act, and the franchise deliberately frames it not as villainy, but rather as a form of mercy. However genuinely brutal that particular mercy appears in actual practice. He understands, finally and completely, that the only way to truly free these trapped souls, the same souls who found partial peace earlier at Fazbear's Fright, but who remain bound, in various diminished forms, to this entire string of locations, is total, complete destruction. Fire claims the building entirely. Fire claims Afton, in whatever finale definitively confirmed state this particular version of him actually exists in during this specific moment. And Fire, according to the game's officially confirmed positive ending, finally releases the lingering spirits trapped throughout this entire saga, including, implicitly, Henry's own daughter Charlie, who he's now finally able to let go of completely, decades removed from first losing her all those years ago. It's worth being completely direct about something here. Some of the more specific details surrounding exactly which spirits are freed, in what particular order, and the full underlying metaphysical mechanics explaining how Charlie's spirit ends up effectively vessel-hopping into Lefty across this extended timeline, blend together ambiguous in-game content with clarifying statements made by the franchise's creator outside the actual games themselves. The core sequence, Henry's entirely deliberate fire, Afton's death within it, and the freeing of these trapped souls, represents confirmed canon. Some of the more granular connective details sit considerably closer to officially endorsed interpretation than hard, definitively on-screen fact, and it's worth understanding that meaningful distinction exists if you decide to dig deeper into this particular chapter on your own afterward. By the conclusion of this chapter, the original founding era of this franchise's story, beginning with two close friends working together in a shared workshop and ending with one of them ultimately choosing burn everything down rather than allow the horror to continue indefinitely, is finally, completely, for good. William Afton is dead. Genuinely, definitively dead this time, not merely trapped within a suit, not simply diminished and quietly waiting to resurface somewhere else down the line. The 5 children from the original pizzeria, Charlie herself, and whatever remained of Elizabeth's lingering presence within the salvage technology, are no longer bound to these machines in any way. Michael Afton survives the fire, with the games deliberately leaving his exact ultimate fate, afterward genuinely quiet. But his specific role within this particular story effectively concludes here as well, his purpose having been fully fulfilled. The Afton family, responsible both as victims and, specifically through William, as the originating source of an enormous amount of accumulated suffering across this entire timeline, is finally, mostly accounted for by this point. But endings within this particular franchise rarely stay genuinely clean for very long. There's a meaningful gap of time following this fire, years where almost nothing whatsoever is officially confirmed, and when the story eventually resurfaces again, it does so somewhere entirely new, accompanied by new technology, an entirely new location, and a deeply unsettling hint that, whatever core remnant of William Afton's consciousness once existed, isn't quite as definitively finished as that particular fire initially suggested. After the fire that closed out the previous chapter, the franchise enters one of its comparatively quieter periods from a purely narrative standpoint. No new restaurant immediately opens for business. No new central character steps forward in the same prominent way Michael, or the crying child, previously did earlier throughout this timeline. Instead, 2 interconnected projects work together to fill in crucial contextual details for what's coming next, while simultaneously and deliberately leaving certain questions genuinely unresolved for the time being. The first of these projects is Ultimate Custom Night, a game constructed less around traditional horror survival gameplay mechanics, and more as a kind of victory lap, or perhaps more accurately a psychological coda, specifically for William Afton himself. The overall setup is genuinely unusual within the franchise's broader context. Every major antagonist from this franchise's accumulated history to this particular point appears together simultaneously within a single, fully customizable night, and the game's framing device strongly suggests this entire experience is actually happening somewhere directly inside Afton's own mind, representing a kind of self-inflicted purgatory constructed from accumulated guilt, persistent fear, and the cumulative weight of every individual horror he's personally caused throughout his life. This particular detail matters considerably for the overall timeline, because it strongly implies something the franchise otherwise never states with complete directness anywhere else. William Afton's underlying consciousness persists in some recognizable form even after his apparent, seemingly, definitive death in the fire, covered in our previous discussion. Whether this persistence is meant entirely literally, representing a soul genuinely trapped within psychological limbo, or functions more symbolically, representing the fundamentally inescapable nature of his own accumulated crimes, eternally catching up with him, remains deliberately ambiguous by design. What is clearly confirmed is simply that the game exists in the first place, that it's explicitly framed as occurring within Afton's own mental space, and that the franchise is actively signaling, even at this point, that his particular story doesn't conclude quite as cleanly as that earlier fire initially suggested to most players. The second project, Five Nights at Freddy's, Help Wanted, approaches this same general period from a notably different angle. Structured as a virtual reality experience within its own internal fiction, it compiles faithful recreations of various classic levels alongside entirely new environmental storytelling elements, much of it specifically through a character called Tape Girl, who guides players through a series of hidden tapes scattered throughout the broader experience. These tapes flesh out numerous smaller, interconnected lore details, but the single most important addition Wanted brings to this overall timeline is something considerably more significant than mere nostalgic callback content. The first genuine appearance of a name and a presence that will go on to define the next major era of this entire story. That is Vanny. Within Help Wanted's broader content, players encounter scattered hints of a mysterious figure connected directly to a strange, distinctive purple rabbit mask, alongside deeply unsettling signs suggesting someone, or perhaps something else entirely, is actively influencing this particular person, from somewhere within their own mind. It's deliberately vague at this stage, functioning considerably more as atmosphere than concrete explanation, but it represents the franchise's first deliberate seed planted for a storyline that won't fully bloom until the major console release arrives years later. The clear implication here, confirmed considerably more directly once that next chapter eventually unfolds, is that William Afton's underlying consciousness, or some lingering digital remnant of it, has somehow found a way to persist and actively spread beyond his original physical body entirely, taking root inside someone else's mind through technology directly connected to this same virtual reality experience. There's a related thread genuinely worth flagging here as well, sourced considerably more from the Fazbear Frights book anthology than from the games themselves directly, involving a corrupted, visibly glitching digital version of Afton, sometimes referred to throughout fan discussion as Glitchtrap. The exact underlying relationship connecting Glitchtrap as a broader concept and Vanny as an individual person remains one of the more genuinely debated areas within official lore, with certain statements treating them as effectively representing the same ongoing threat, while others draw a slightly more meaningful separation between the underlying digital entity and its eventual human host. Rather than presenting one particular version as definitively settled fact, it's worth simply acknowledging here directly. A corrupted piece of William Afton, existing in some digital or psychological form, genuinely survives the fire covered in our previous discussion, and it begins actively working its way into an entirely new vessel during this particular period, setting up consequences that won't fully surface until considerably later within this timeline. What this entire period collectively establishes, even through its comparatively more abstract and experimental storytelling format, is that Afton was never quite as definitively finished as that earlier fire initially suggested to most players and observers. Whatever actually burned during the events of the previous chapter, his original mind, his fundamental drive toward causing harm, somehow found a way to persist regardless. Exactly how this persistence actually functions is deliberately left as one of this timeline's more intentionally unresolved mysteries, functioning considerably more as implication than as any confirmed, concrete mechanism. But its underlying existence is genuinely clear, and its eventual consequences are about to become the central, defining focus of an entirely new location, an entirely new scale of horror, and an entirely new central character who has absolutely no idea what she's about to become entangled in. Before the franchise's story resumes once again through additional games, a substantial amount of connective lore arrives instead through an entirely different medium. A series of short story anthologies, collectively known as Fazbear Frights. It's worth being genuinely upfront about exactly how this particular material fits into the broader timeline, because it occupies a slightly different tier of canon compared to the mainline games themselves. Most individual stories contained within these various anthology books function as self-contained horror tales, featuring original characters and original situations that aren't directly tied to the Afton family's overarching saga at all. These generally function considerably more as tonal flavor and atmosphere-setting content rather than hard, confirmed canon, and treating every single detail across every individual story as definitively confirmed fact would represent a genuine mistake. However, scattered throughout these various anthologies are specific framing device stories and recurring elements that the franchise's creator has explicitly confirmed do connect directly back to the mainline timeline. And these particular pieces are genuinely worth focusing on here specifically. The single most important connective thread running through this material involves the corporate side of this overall story, something the game-focused chapters covered so far have only briefly touched upon. Fazbear Entertainment, despite the genuinely catastrophic string of tragedies attached to its name across every single previous location covered throughout this story, doesn't simply vanish entirely following the fire that closed out the previous era. Corporate restructuring, comprehensive rebranding efforts, and a renewed, deliberate push to distance the company's public image from its genuinely disastrous history all take place during this particular period, conveyed through framing narration connected specifically to these anthology books, rather than through single, dedicated game. This is also where the digital remnant of William Afton, introduced earlier as Glitchtrap, gets meaningfully developed considerably further. Material spread across these various books reinforces the underlying idea that some corrupted piece of Afton's original consciousness genuinely survived in digital form, embedded directly within software connected to the same virtual reality technology explored previously through Help Wanted. The exact technical explanation for precisely how a human consciousness ends up persisting as corrupted code remains one of this franchise's intentionally hand-wavy fiction elements, rather than something explained with genuine real-world technical rigor. And it's entirely fair to flag this as a place where the franchise consistently prioritizes horror atmosphere over hard logical consistency. What these particular books confirm considerably more solidly is this timeline's next major construction project. During the years immediately following the previous era's collapse, Fazbear Entertainment, now rebuilt and thoroughly rebranded, begins developing something considerably larger and more genuinely ambitious than any single restaurant covered throughout this story so far. A massive entertainment complex combining multiple distinct attractions, performance venues, and animatronic shows together under one unified roof. This particular location will eventually become known as Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex, and it represents the company's deliberate attempt to bury its accumulated history beneath sheer spectacle and scale, a strategy that, as you might already expect given everything covered throughout this story, so far, doesn't end up working out quite the way its executives genuinely hope it will. A young woman named Vanessa, introduced considerably more directly during this particular period, becomes connected to the lingering digital remnant of Afton throughout these years, with the exact circumstances explaining how and why this connection forms kept deliberately obscured across different pieces of material. By the time this timeline's next major chapter formally begins, she's already become deeply entangled with this corrupted presence, operating increasingly under the influence of what's become known publicly, both within the broader fandom and increasingly within official lore itself, as the masked identity Vanny. By the conclusion of this connective period, all the necessary pieces are fully in place for the franchise's next major console release. A new, genuinely maskation exists, eager to put the company's bloody accumulated history behind it through scale and aggressive modernization. A new central human character, Vanessa, carries within her the lingering digital influence of William Afton himself, and the franchise is about to test, on its biggest stage, yet by a considerable margin, whether any conceivable amount of corporate rebranding could possibly bury something this fundamentally, irreparably rotten. It can't, and the next major chapter of this story's exactly why, in considerable detail, which is precisely where we're headed next as we continue tracing William Afton's complete journey through to the present day. A boy named Gregory sneaks into Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex after hours, not realizing he's about to spend an entire night trapped inside the largest, most ambitious location this franchise has ever constructed. This is the setup for Five Nights at Freddy's security breach, and it represents a genuinely significant structural departure from nearly everything covered throughout this story so far. For the first time across this entire franchise's history, players aren't confined to a single room sitting behind a desk. They're moving freely throughout an enormous, multi-level complex, actively being hunted rather than simply monitoring security cameras from relative safety. The Pizzaplex itself directly reflects everything established in our previous discussion regarding Fazbear Entertainment's rebranding ambitions. Multiple distinct sections, a glamorous new lineup of performing animatronics, collectively known as the Glamrock line, including Glamrock Freddy, Glamrock Chica, Micah, Montgomery Gator, and Roxanne Wolf, and an overall aesthetic deliberately built to feel nothing whatsoever like the cramped, dimly lit pizzerias covered earlier throughout this story. It's considerably bigger, noticeably brighter, and on the surface, appears completely disconnected from the horror of William Afton's original crimes covered extensively throughout our previous sections. That carefully constructed surface doesn't hold for very long at all. Gregory, locked inside overnight with no immediate way out, finds an unexpected ally in Glamrock Freddy, who becomes his primary protector throughout the night, guiding him through the building's various sections while simultaneously warning him. Considerably more immediate threat. Actively stalking the halls, a masked figure wearing a distinctive rabbit mask. This is Vanny, the character first introduced through Help Wanted's environmental storytelling, and subsequently developed considerably further through the Fazbear Frights material, covered in our previous discussion. Across the course of this single, eventful night, the full picture of Vanny's overall situation comes into considerably sharper focus, though the game itself deliberately maintains some genuine ambiguity around exact mechanics, even while clearly confirming the broader strokes of what's actually happening. Vanessa, the same young woman connected directly to the corrupted digital remnant of William Afton covered in our previous discussion, has been influenced and actively manipulated by this lingering presence over an extended period, to the point where her actions throughout the Pizzaplex are driven, at least to some genuinely significant degree, by Afton's continuing while operating actively through her. Whether this situation represents full, complete possession, psychological manipulation that gradually eroded her own personal autonomy over time, or some meaningful blend of both possibilities, is left as one of this particular chapter's more actively interpreted aspects, though the underlying, confirmed fact itself, that Afton's influence is actively directing genuinely dangerous behavior through Vanessa, isn't seriously in question at any point. The night builds steadily toward multiple possible outcomes, since Security Breach is deliberately structured with several genuinely distinct endings, depending heavily on the specific choices players make throughout, something genuinely worth acknowledging directly here rather than treating any single particular ending as the sole, definitive outcome. Across these various possible paths, though, certain core reveals remain entirely consistent regardless of which specific ending a given playthrough ultimately follows. The Pizzaplex harbors hidden, deliberately decommissioned section located beneath its main public areas, and within that hidden space waits something the game's marketing materials kept deliberately obscured before its initial release. A decayed, hybrid creature known as Springtrap. Springtrap represents the physical, mechanically reconstituted remnant of William Afton's original body, fused once again with damaged animatronic components in a manner that evokes the exact same body horror imagery established all the way back with Springtrap and continuing forward through Trap. His appearance within this particular chapter confirms something the previous two chapters had only ever implied. The digital consciousness actively operating through Vanny and the physical remains of Afton's body, previously presumed destroyed entirely in the fire that ended the earlier era of this story, are genuinely connected, representing the same underlying entity expressing itself simultaneously through two entirely different forms, one digital and fundamentally psychological in nature, the other physical and mechanical. The eventual confrontation with Springtrap, and the ultimate fate of both Gregory and Vanessa individually, varies considerably depending on which specific ending path a given playthrough happens to follow, ranging anywhere from more genuinely hopeful outcomes where Gregory successfully escapes. Vanessa shows clear signs of finally breaking free from Afton's lingering influence, all the way to considerably darker outcomes that leave both characters' ultimate fates genuinely, considerably more uncertain by comparison. Rather than asserting one specific ending as the singular, definitive canon outcome here, it's considerably more accurate to say the franchise has deliberately left this particular question genuinely open at the game's own narrative level, with subsequent material providing some, though admittedly not complete, additional clarity on the matter going forward. What is clear by the conclusion of this particular chapter is the broader thematic throughline, connecting all the way back to the very beginning of this entire story. Decades removed from a friendship between two engineers first souring into outright tragedy. After diners, pizzerias, underground facilities, horror attractions, and one final, deliberate fire specifically to end this story for good, William Afton's lingering influence still hasn't been completely. He persists, fragmented across both digital code and physical wreckage, still actively finding ways to manipulate the people closest to whatever technology his accumulated legacy happens to touch. The Mega Pizzaplex, built specifically to bury this accumulated history beneath spectacle, instead becomes the site of its most expansive, most genuinely ambiguous continuation yet. And in the aftermath of that single chaotic night, with Vanessa's ultimate fate left genuinely uncertain depending heavily on how that particular night actually concluded, a new investigator arrives at the ruins of the Pizzaplex roughly 1 year later, determined to uncover answers the main story, deliberately unresolved. 1 year removed from the events inside the Mega Pizzaplex, the building no longer operates as a fully functioning entertainment complex in any meaningful sense. It sits partially abandoned, partially repurposed, with its more ambitious sections sealed off entirely and left to gradually decay following whatever exactly happened during Gregory's eventful night inside. Into this wreckage steps an entirely new character, working through what's presented as an augmented reality investigation application, sent specifically to document and thoroughly explore the ruins left behind. This represents the framing device behind Five Nights at Freddy's security breach, ruin, and the character actively guiding players through this particular investigation, referred in-game primarily through an artificial intelligence assistant called ARI, is eventually revealed to be considerably more significant to this overall timeline than a simple investigator might initially suggest. Her name is Cassidy, and her connection to this story all the way back to the franchise's very earliest chapters, in a reveal that meaningfully retroactively reframes certain details from the original Five Nights at Freddy's that fans had actively debated for years following its initial release. Cassidy, it's confirmed through this particular content, was actually one of the 5 children murdered at the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the same group of victims covered extensively in our earlier discussion. Specifically, material connected directly to this particular release identifies her as the spirit originally tied to Golden Freddy, adding both a name and a considerably fuller identity to a character who had previously existed within the fandom's understanding primarily as a glitch-like mystery, rather than as a fully realized individual victim. This doesn't actually retcon anything previously established earlier, so much as it genuinely completes a picture the franchise had deliberately left incomplete for a very long time prior to this release. Cassidy's specific motivations driving the events of the Ruin investigation tie directly back to Vanessa, the character left in deliberately uncertain circumstances at the conclusion of the previous chapter, without asserting any single definitive answer to exactly what happened to Vanessa throughout the events of Security Breach. Since the base game's various branching endings keep that particular question genuinely open by design, Ruin's content makes clear that Cassidy's spirit is specifically invested in uncovering the genuine truth and, according to certain interpretations, in offering some meaningful form of protection or resolution connected directly to Vanessa's ultimate fate. The investigation itself eventually uncovers an entirely new, genuinely dangerous presence lurking somewhere within the Pizzaplex's ruins, distinct entirely from anything connected directly to William Afton's lingering consciousness. This is the Mimic, an animatronic artificial intelligence system possessing the ability to copy voices, mimic other established characters, and manipulate its surrounding environment in ways that initially confuse players into mistakenly assuming they're dealing with familiar threats already established earlier throughout this story. The Mimic's full nature and underlying origin within the Pizzaplex's broader technology infrastructure represents one more genuinely unresolved threads going into this particular point in the timeline, deliberately positioned by the franchise as an entirely new, semi-independent danger rather than simply functioning as another extension of Afton's ongoing influence. This particular distinction matters considerably for understanding exactly where the overall story stands by this point. Not every single horror left active within this timeline traces directly back to William Afton anymore. The Pizzaplex's own internal systems, built with sufficient independent complexity and ambition, have apparently generated dangers entirely of their own accord, suggesting the franchise's central threat is genuinely broadening beyond one family's tragic history into something considerably closer to systemic, technological horror that's effectively outgrown its original architect entirely. By the conclusion of Ruin, players have gained a considerably fuller, properly named identity for one of the franchise's oldest lingering mysteries in Cassidy, meaningfully deepened the uncertainty surrounding Vanessa's ultimate fate rather than fully resolving it outright, and been introduced to an entirely new, distinctly separate threat in the Mimic that carries genuine implications for whatever comes next within this ongoing story. It's a chapter that adds considerable clarity to old, long-standing questions, while deliberately opening up entirely new ones, entirely consistent with this franchise's long-standing tendency to never fully close every single door it opens along the way. The most recently confirmed major addition to this overall timeline arrives through a different format than most of what's come before it. A book, paired alongside an accompanying short film adaptation, called Into the Pit. Set against the backdrop of the franchise's ongoing print canon, this particular story introduces a central character named Oswald, who encounters a mysterious mirror-based attraction at one of the franchise's various pizzeria locations, one that turns out to enable a form of time travel between different points scattered throughout this timeline's accumulated history. Without spoiling the specific narrative details surrounding exactly how this particular mechanism functions, since this remains genuinely recent, actively discussed canon at the time of this release, the broad significance for the overall timeline is straightforward. Into the Pit directly connects a present-day character to events and figures from William Afton's earlier history, reinforcing just how far-reaching and genuinely persistent the consequences of those original decisions, made decades earlier at the very beginning of this story, continue to be felt throughout every subsequent era of this ongoing narrative. This particular material also ties directly into the franchise's growing theatrical presence, following the success of the first feature film adaptation, with ongoing development continuing to expand this universe across multiple mediums simultaneously. Because this represents the most current edge of confirmed canon, it's worth being especially direct about something here. Some of the broader implications and connections suggested by this particular material remain in active discussion within the fan community without full, definitive clarification arriving yet from official sources on every single detail. Where that's genuinely the case throughout this section, treat it as simply the most recent confirmed information currently available, rather than as a fully closed chapter, the way most of this timeline's earlier history has gradually become. What's genuinely clear is that the franchise has absolutely no intention of fully closing William Afton's story for good. Decades after two friends originally opened a small diner together, after dozens of confirmed deaths, after fires specifically meant to end this story permanently, and after corporate rebrands specifically meant to bury its accumulated history, Five Nights at Freddy's keeps finding new ways to extend its central mystery forward, while still consistently treating its foundational tragedy, William Afton's decisions and the devastation they caused across an entire extended family and dozens of innocent children, as the gravitational center. Everything else throughout this franchise continues to orbit around. There's one more piece of this puzzle genuinely worth addressing directly before we move toward drawing everything together. The question of why William Afton, specifically, became this particular franchise's defining villain rather than simply one antagonist among several competing for that same position. Part of the answer lies in just how thoroughly human his motivations remain throughout, even at his absolute worst. He isn't an alien force, a demon, or some externalized supernatural curse visited upon an otherwise innocent man. He's a father, a business partner, and an engineer who consistently chose, again and again across multiple decades and multiple opportunities to keep building dangerous machines despite mounting undeniable evidence of exactly what they were capable of doing to the people closest to him. This consistency is precisely what makes him so unsettling as a character, considerably more than any single jump scare or any individual death could ever accomplish on its own. Most horror villains operate from a single, clearly defined motivation: revenge, hunger, religious obsession, simple uncomplicated malice. Afton's motivation, to the extent the franchise ever genuinely clarifies it at all, seems to be something considerably colder and more clinical than any of those options. He appears genuinely fascinated by the technology itself, by the unsettling, liminal space where machinery starts to resemble something authentically alive, to a degree that consistently outweighs whatever value he places on the actual human lives, including his own children's lives, that technology repeatedly ends up costing along the way. This particular reading isn't universally agreed upon across the fandom, and it's worth being honest about that here. Some interpretations lean considerably more heavily into reading Afton as someone who actively enjoys causing harm for its own sake, treating his fascination with the technology as secondary to a more straightforward sadism. Others read him as someone whose initial intentions may have genuinely started somewhere closer to ordinary ambition, before gradually, incrementally curdling into something considerably darker across repeated exposure to tragedy and a complete absence of meaningful consequences. The franchise itself never definitively resolves this particular question, and that ambiguity, frustrating as it can occasionally for fans seeing absolute clarity, is very plausibly intentional. A villain whose interior psychology remains genuinely opaque is considerably harder to neatly categorize and considerably harder to simply dismiss than one whose motivations arrive fully, conveniently explained. What remains entirely beyond dispute, regardless of which particular psychological interpretation you personally find most compelling, the accumulated body count and the consistent pattern underlying it. Charlie, the crying child. 5 children murdered at the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Phone guy and additional children at the second location. Elizabeth, his own daughter. Michael, his own son, transformed irreversibly by Enard. And that's accounting only for the deaths directly, unambiguously attributable to William Afton himself, without even factoring in the considerably broader ripple effects his acts caused across Henry Emily's entire remaining life, across Vanessa's eventual entanglement with his lingering digital remnant, or across whatever ultimately happened to Gregory and the Pizzaplex's various employees throughout the events of Security Breach. It's also worth directly addressing, before we move toward this story's conclusion, a question fans have debated extensively over the years. Is William Afton, in any meaningful sense, ultimately redeemable, or does the franchise ever genuinely attempt to humanize him beyond simple, straightforward villainy? The honest answer is that the franchise mostly resists this particular temptation, and that restraint feels like a deliberate creative choice rather than any kind of oversight. Unlike Henry, who receives a genuinely sympathetic arc built around grief, guilt, and an eventual act of devastating, costly sacrifice, Afton is never granted a comparable moment of clear remorse, clear self-awareness, or any kind of meaningful redemption arc anywhere across the games or books. Even Ultimate Custom Night, which comes closest to depicting some form of interior psychological state for him, frames that state primarily through fear and accumulated paranoia rather than through any genuine remorse for what he's actually done to others. This absence is itself meaningful. The franchise seems considerably less interested in explaining away William Afton's cruelty than in simply, repeatedly demonstrating its real, lasting consequences across multiple generations of characters connected to him. Charlie's death shapes Henry's entire remaining life. The crying child's death shapes Michael's entire guilt-ridden trajectory. Elizabeth's death directly creates the very technology that eventually destroys her own brother's body. Every single tragedy in this story ripples forward considerably further than its original moment. And Afton himself remains, throughout, the singular point of origin. All those ripples can be consistently traced directly back to. By the time you reach the present moment in this franchise's ongoing story, with Into the Pit extending the timeline forward, and with the Mimic representing a genuinely new kind of threat no longer directly tethered to Afton's original consciousness, something quietly remarkable has happened to his particular role within the broader narrative. He's no longer, strictly speaking, the active, ongoing driving every single new release forward. His body is destroyed. His digital remnant's exact current status remains genuinely uncertain, depending on which ending of security breach you personally treat as canon. But his influence persists regardless, embedded permanently within the franchise's entire underlying structure. The originating wound everything else continues to be built directly on top of. That's precisely what makes William Afton such an enduringly compelling villain. Even now, considerably more than a decade removed from the original game's initial release. He isn't simply a monster you defeat once and then move past entirely. He's a slow-burning, multi-generational tragedy, one whose full consequences took years of careful, methodical storytelling across numerous games, multiple novels, and an entire anthology series, for both characters and players alike to fully comprehend in their complete, accumulated entirety. There's a particular kind of horror story that fades the moment you finish it. You feel the jump scare, you close the game or the book, and within a week the details blur together into something generic, indistinguishable from a dozen other monsters you've encountered elsewhere. William Afton was never that kind of villain, and by now, having walked through his entire story from a workshop friendship decades ago, all the way to a pizzaplex still being investigated in the present day, you understand exactly why. He endures because he was never given the comfort of a clean origin. No single childhood wound. No supernatural curse imposed on an innocent man from the outside. No moment where the story tells you definitively, here he stopped being a person and became a monster. Instead, the franchise gives you a man who was already, from the very earliest material we have access to, drawn towards something cold and obsessive in his relationship with machinery. And then it simply lets you watch what that obsession costs everyone around him, year after year, location after location, without ever fully explaining whether the obsession came first or the cruelty did. That refusal to resolve the question is not a gap in the writing. It is the writing. Consider, actually separates Afton from nearly every other antagonist this genre has produced. Most horror villains are defined by a single excess: too much hunger, too much rage, too much religious certainty, too much grief curdled into vengeance. Afton's defining trait is almost the opposite. He is defined by a deficit. Something in him that should have stopped him, the ordinary human recoil most people feel at watching a child suffer, simply does not activate the way it should. Charlie dies at his hands, and he keeps building. His own son dies, in part because of bullying his own family enabled, and he keeps building. 5 more children die in his restaurant, and he keeps building. His own daughter Elizabeth dies inside a machine his company manufactured and approved, and he keeps building. At no point in this entire accumulated history does the story show him pausing, recalculating, or even hesitating in any way that suggests internal conflict. The horror is not that he snapped. The horror is that there was apparently nothing to snap. This is precisely why fans have spent over a decade arguing about his interior psychology without ever reaching consensus, and why that argument will probably never fully resolve. Some read him as someone who started with recognizable, even sympathetic ambitions, a man who wanted to build wonder for children the way Henry did, and who simply lost himself somewhere along the way, the obsession with lifelike machinery slowly replacing every other value he once held. Under this reading, Afton is tragic in the oldest sense, a man destroyed by his own gift, similar to an artist who sacrifices his family for his work without ever quite admitting that's what he's doing. Others reject this reading entirely, and the evidence supports them just as well. Under this interpretation, Afton was never actually building toward wonder at all. He used the language of childhood entertainment, family diners, friendly mascots, birth parties, as camouflage for something that was always primarily about control, about secrecy, about the specific thrill of operating unseen inside a system designed to look harmless. The murders at the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, carried out using a costume specifically chosen because children trusted it, support this reading powerfully. This was not a man who lost his way. This was a man who built an entire business model perfectly suited to what he already wanted to do, long before he ever did it. The franchise never forces you to choose between these two readings, and that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about what kind of story this actually is. Five Nights at Freddy's could have been written as a simple monster narrative, something you defeat and then leave behind. Instead, it was written as a multi-generational case study in what unchecked harm does to everyone who survives in its orbit, told gradually in fragments, the same way trauma actually surfaces in real families. Slowly and completely, through details people would rather not have to assemble. Look at what each subsequent generation actually inherits from him. Henry Emily inherits decades of misplaced grief, believing his daughter's death was an accident until he finally learns the truth. A truth that doesn't liberate him so much as it gives his eventual sacrifice its full, devastating shape. Michael Afton inherits guilt over his role in his own brother's death. Guilt that drives him directly into the underground facility where he loses his body to Ennard, and later drives him to build an entire restaurant as bait specifically to draw his own father back into the light. Vanessa, generations removed from the original tragedy, inherits a corrupted digital remnant of a man she likely never met in any meaningful sense, her own autonomy slowly eroded by an influence and may not have even fully understood was happening to her. Even Cassidy, one of the 5 original murdered children, spends what should have been her eternal rest instead investigating a pizzaplex built generations after her own death, still tangled in consequences that trace back to a man who killed her as a child. This is the actual mechanism by which William Afton remains frightening even now, long after his physical body has supposedly burned for the final time. He doesn't need to personally appear in a game for his presence to be felt. His decisions function like a slow-acting poison administered to an entire extended family tree, and the franchise's storytelling structure, deliberately fragmented, deliberately non-chronological in its release order, deliberately willing to leave certain questions permanently unresolved, mirrors exactly how family actually processes this kind of generational damage. Not all at once, not in order, pieced together years later, often by people who weren't even present for the original wound. It's also worth acknowledging directly, here at the conclusion, just how unusual it is for a horror franchise built around jump scares and animatronic mascots to sustain this level of sustained fan engagement with its underlying themes for over a decade. Plenty of horror games have scarier individual moments. Very few have inspired the same volume of patient, detail-oriented analysis, kind of community effort required to notice that a phone call's audio contains a hidden voice line, or that an Easter egg buried in a minigame's background pixel pattern actually changes a name's interpretation. That level of engagement doesn't happen with a story that's only about being scared. It happens with a story that's actually about something, even when that something is conveyed through cartoonish animal mascots and minigames rather than through prestige drama dialogue. What it's about, ultimately, is the specific horror of trusted systems failing the people who depend on them, and the specific cowardice of choosing convenience over confronting what you already suspect to be true. Henry trusted his business partner for years longer than the evidence should have allowed, and that trust cost him everything. Parents across this fictional world trusted that a restaurant mascot, by definition, could not possibly be dangerous, and that trust cost them their children. Employees trusted that a night shift was simply a night shift, Nothing more sinister than boredom and bad pay. And some of them never made it home. Afton's entire pattern of violence depends, every single time, on exploiting exactly this kind of reasonable, ordinary trust, the kind none of us would think twice about extending in our own lives. That's a considerably more unsettling premise than a literal monster jumping out of the dark, because it doesn't require you to believe in animatronics or curses to recognize the underlying shape of the fear. There is also something genuinely rare in how thoroughly this franchise commits to consequence over spectacle. Afton dies, in some form, repeatedly throughout this story, and each time, the story resists the temptation to simply reset him back to a clean slate for the next installment. He doesn't come back unscathed. He comes back as Springtrap, barely alive, fused permanently with collapsed machinery. He comes back as Scraptrap, further diminished, further decayed. He comes back as Burntrap, his physical body and his corrupted digital consciousness merging into something that is less a man wearing a costume and more a man who has, through repeated mechanical betrayal, become almost indistinguishable from the wreckage itself. Each resurrection costs him something. Each one leaves him less human than before. This is not a villain who escapes consequence. This is a villain who is slowly, deliberately ground down by the very technology he spent his life building, suit by suit, fire by fire, until what remains is barely recognizable as the man who once stood in a workshop with Henry Emily, dreaming about machines that could move and talk and seem almost alive. That image, the two of them at the very beginning, full of genuine ambition and shared excitement, is worth returning to now that you know everything that follows from it. It's easy, having walked through the entire accumulated horror of this story, to forget that it started somewhere ordinary, somewhere almost hopeful. A shared dream. Daughters who grew up trusting their father's work completely. That image is not an aberration the rest of the story betrays. It's the entire point. The horror only works because it grows directly out of something that should have stayed safe, should have stayed warm, should have stayed exactly what it looked like on the surface. William Afton's story is frightening not despite its mundane beginning, but specifically because of it. So why, after this many years, after multiple games, 3 novel trilogies, an entire anthology series, a feature film, and now an expanding print canon, still actively adding new chapters, does this story remain one of gaming's most enduringly discussed mysteries? Part of it is structural. The franchise's commitment to fragmented, non-linear storytelling rewards exactly the kind of obsessive, collaborative investigation this fandom has built its entire culture around. But the deeper reason is simpler than any of that. William Afton works as a villain because the story never lets you fully resolve him. You can trace every murder. You can name every victim. You can place every event in its correct chronological order, the way we've done across this entire account. And at the end of all that careful work, you still don't know, with full certainty, what was actually happening inside him the entire time. That unresolved center, a man who did all of this and was never required to explain himself, is the single detail this franchise has never been willing to hand over. And maybe that's exactly why his story refuses to end. Every new piece of confirmed lore answers one question and quietly opens 2 more. Every fire meant to finish him leaves some fragment behind, in a suit, in a server, in a daughter who was never quite herself again. 5 Nights at Freddy's has had over a decade to close this book completely. Every single time it's had the opportunity, it has chosen instead to leave the cover open just slightly, enough for one more hand to push through. That's the story of William Afton. From a workshop dream to a name that still makes people stop scrolling the moment they see it. Whatever comes next for this franchise, whatever new game, new book, or new film eventually surfaces, you can be reasonably certain his name will be somewhere underneath it, because at this point, this entire world simply doesn't function without him.